Rayman. What the hell is this thing? We live in a world where the biggest mascots in classic platformer games consist of an Italian plumber from Japan, an obscure Australian marsupial,
You don't even look like a bandicoot!
a hedgehog that ironically runs fast, and smaller scale mascots including an extinct Australian marsupial, a musical bear, and a cat that we never speak of. And yet Rayman is somehow stranger than all of these things. So if you've happened to nose around my channel for a bit, you might have noticed that I have a particular liking towards the Rayman franchise. And if dedicating a whole video on why one particular game of his was my childhood favorite wasn't enough to appease my enjoyment of this character, then how about more or less his entire history? Because what's interesting about him is that despite having what's widely regarded as a solid run of games, he just never managed to stick to the walls as a long-running franchise, the same way that other mascots like Crash Bandicoot or Mario did. But why was this? To find out, let's go all the way back to the very beginning and learn how we got from this to this.
Sex bomb, you're a sex bomb.
Any fan of Rayman could tell you that the titular character was the child of one French video game designer, Michel Ancel. But Ancel was actually born in Monaco in 1972, and would travel the world a lot as a child due to his father's role in the military, which may have inspired his avid interest in nature and environments, and discovering a fondness for video games while in Tunisia. As for Rayman himself, he wasn't born out of some video game design board where they were asked to come up with some mascot by a group of executives on the spot. No. In fact, Rayman is quite literally Ancel's very own OC that he created back when he was a teenager. He'd stated in an interview how he used to draw pictures of this character Rayman back in the 1980s, climbing large trees and chasing strange insects, claiming Celtic, Chinese, and Russian fairy tales were his main source of inspiration. In 1986, 5 brothers by the family name of Guillermo had founded the French video game publisher Ubisoft, then 2 words, initially in Paris, Créteil, and Brittany. By 1988, they hired Ancel as one of a few developers for the studio after he impressed them with his animation skills. He would start getting into computer coding and graphic ray tracing, and work on the very first Rayman game would begin. An initial idea for the video game would be to focus on a boy named Jimmy, and Jimmy would create this imaginary online world for himself called Here It's Cool. Names weren't exactly Michel's strong suit. A computer virus would suck Jimmy into his own world, embody him into his in-world avatar, that just happened to be Rayman, and he'd have to fight this virus in order to free himself. Basically Jumanji style. Maybe that's why people ship him with Pomni so much. Needless to say, this idea was scrapped. Nevertheless, the studio saw potential in Ancel's vision, having allegedly looked at his animations for a trombone-themed level and other strange ideas, and the game was officially greenlit in 1992 and was given a budget of 15 million francs. With help from programmer Frederick Oud and artist Alexandre Stiebler, work on Rayman was well underway. Initially, Ancel intended to produce the game for the Atari ST computer, but decided against it when it turned out ET had permanently eviscerated all hope for an Atari comeback. They would then set sights on the SNES, but scrapped that idea as well since they didn't think their cartridges would be powerful enough to handle the game they were making, leaving an entire SNES build of Rayman 1 started but unfinished. So, what did they choose instead? They wanted to be an exclusive for the Atari Jaguar, which is a cartridge-based console. God bless Ubisoft. In the end, clearer minds prevailed, and Ubisoft made the decision to make Rayman a launch title for Sony's upcoming console, the allegedly quite powerful disc-based PlayStation. More and more developers came onto the project, and soon, Michel Ancel's childhood fantasy was released to the public. Rayman was released on September 1st, 1995, coming to PlayStation, Sega Saturn, Windows, MS-DOS, and the Atari Jaguar. The 2D platformer side-scroller ended up with a much simpler story than the one Ancel originally envisioned. Taking place within Rayman's harmonious fictitious world, a villain known as Mr. Dark, the name creativity is ever-present, steals the Great Protoon, which keeps the world's harmony intact, and scattering the Protoon's workers known as Electoons. makes you wonder when the new tunes will come in. It is then up to Rayman, with help from Patilla the Fairy, to venture forth and defeat Mr. Dark. You would then journey through forests, caves, musical instruments, and giant drawing equipment, unlocking powers on your way, freeing the captured Electoons, collecting items known as Tings, and fighting off enemies including Bzzz, Space Mama, Mr. Sax, and Mr. Stone. I once had a headmaster called Mr. Stone. But I think we could touch on the elephant in the room here, which is Rayman's actual design. Keep in mind that some of what we see might just be what a small boy with big creative dreams happened to dream up, and some came from the help of people working at Ubisoft. So let's see. He's got a neckerchief, and that ring on his shirt that portrays a kind of heroic look about him, some odd looking hair that's probably to allow him to fly or hover with ease when he can, and
You've got no arms left!
So apparently the reason why Rayman doesn't have any limbs, and his remaining body parts are rendered floating, was that they found it too difficult to animate limbs in motion. So they did the only natural thing, and tossed those limbs into the trash, and rendered his animations without them, leading to most of his attacks consisting of literally throwing his fist far in front of him like a biological boomerang. And then they removed his neck as well to make sure he wasn't too eldritch, and could in theory survive the French Revolution. And finally getting into this game, you can really see what Michel Ancel was going for back then. If this is what Ancel's childhood fantasy world was like when creating Rayman as a teen, then I want to be a part of it. The atmosphere is whimsical and quirky as hell, fully leaning into that cartoony side, with bullets with mechanical arms swinging mallets, captivating visual design and color in every stage, and while it's not my favorite overall Rayman soundtrack, but still really freaking good, it still contains some of the most beautiful sounding tracks in the entire franchise, or hell, any game I've ever played. And even the pencil ASMR song later on, I just see as clever and inventive more than anything. The game itself sold very well after release, selling 400,000 copies by the end of the year and 900,000 by 1997, and managed to be the best-selling PS1 game of all time in the UK, beating out games like Gran Turismo and Tomb Raider.
Take that, you marsupial fiend!
It still made a good impact worldwide too, for a good while sitting in the top 20 best-selling games for the PS1, being one of the oldest games up there, and remained the highest 2D game on the list, and earned itself a place as one of 20 titles included in the PlayStation Classic replica console. He won the title of Best New Character of 1995 by Electronic Gaming Monthly, and was considered as basically the mascot for the Atari Jaguar console, being one of only 50 licensed games to officially come to the cartridge console. The game received quite high critical reception upon release too, with magazines praising the game for its stunning visuals and animation, atmosphere, soundtrack, and high difficulty. Though one review from Sega Saturn magazine did criticize the game for getting dull quite often, and as being, quote, plain irritating and damned difficult. And damned difficult it was. I can't find any official sources on it, but I am convinced that playtesting was performed solely by the level designers themselves, with nobody actually coming in from the outside world to try this out for themselves. If there's one thing about this game that hasn't aged well in the slightest, it's the control and how this game feels so unfairly difficult to the point where it feels borderline impossible. The player movement is slow by design and is coupled with a really floaty jump, which the later helicopter ability doesn't help too much of, and this is put together with tons of enemies and obstacles that can literally appear without a second's notice or be virtually impossible to notice because they're just off screen with little to no time for any reaction to them. And this goes hand in hand with an unforgiving continue life system. If you run out of lives, you get the chance to play a continue and pick up from the section you left off from, but when you soon quickly run out of those, you then have no choice but to return back to the start of what are, to me, mostly very long levels, and have to contend with all the unfair enemy and obstacle placement again. And even if you're just trying to get through a level unscathed, unscathed to move on from it, the final nail in the coffin is that you need to find and collect every single unlockable in the game just to unlock the last boss fight. Like, at least in Crash 4, getting 100% is optional and you don't need every gem just to finish the game's bloody story. But I digress. This game has been proven beatable, but it will take blood, sweat, and tears just to get barely halfway through this thing. And people gave it a fair pass in those days because we still hadn't gotten over the video arcade days where every game was near impossible to beat by default. I'm sorry, but I cannot recommend this game as it is for its difficulty alone. Which is a shame, because everything else is so gorgeous and wonderfully presented and deserves to be applauded. Of course, you can still give it a go if you like, but you have been warned. If only there was another, bigger, free version of this game that fixed this insane difficulty jump. Oh, and there was also a review by GameSpot criticizing the game for its opening cutscene taking 50 megabytes of data. Oh, those simpler times. After the success of Rayman, Ubisoft continued working in support for this game, with additional ports on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. There were plans to develop a port for the Sega Genesis, but that never came through. There were multiple educational versions for the game, where you had to answer mathematical equations correctly or face certain death. It also featured Rayman singing this.
C'est moi le fameux Rayman, si beau et tellement costaud.
And apparently this clown is actually engaged to Patilla the Fairy, and this annoying cricket thing is meant to be representative of the English. So, thanks, I guess, Frenchie. They also released an expansion on the PC port called Rayman Designer, which featured 24 new levels, plus a custom level designer. This was then followed by a second expansion, Rayman by His Fans, which included another 40 new levels, all of which were made by the community on the previous expansion and were handpicked by Ubisoft themselves. Oh, and apparently the SNES prototype was eventually found in 2017, which got released online with permission by Ansel himself. But of course, with the success of the first game and momentum rolling, a sequel had to be made. The original Rayman 2 began development as early as a few months after the first game's release, and was originally slated for release by the end of 1996 for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. It was supposed to be another 2D side-scroller much like the original game, but this time featured pre-rendered bitmaps of 3D computer models rather than being hand-drawn. It would introduce a new enemy in the form of robots from space, who would imprison Patilla the Fairy, and feature a device that would allow Rayman to teleport between the foreground and the background of the stage. Kinda similar to later games, but this version would never come to be. See, 1996 was one of the years where platformers took the risky leap into the world of 3D, with games like the original Crash Bandicoot, Super Mario 64, and Banjo-Kazooie innovating the mascot platformer forever. So with those games racing far ahead, before the end of the year, the current Rayman 2 project was shelved by May 1996, and development was started from scratch. With Michel Ancel once again directing this new 3D version of Rayman, the team was once again faced with a similar issue as before. Which bloody platform do we release this on? Despite Rayman 1 being a flagship for the Sony PlayStation, Ubisoft were eyeing PC once again to be their lead platform, being as that was where all their expansions were released for the initial game. But then they changed their minds and flagshipped for the Nintendo 64, at the cost of some of their higher quality textures. That's right, we're going all the way back to cartridge consoles again. A 1998 beta for Rayman 2 was discovered in October 2024, showcasing 2 levels from the final game. The channel Corkman does a great little dive into it, but some notable features, besides some very rough control or unfinished textures, includes this much less simplistic health bar at the top displayed as a ring or amulet thing, and the fact that you could toggle between Rayman throwing his energy ball things to attack, and actually throwing his fist like in every single other game. Which, when you look at what they went with in the end, you can see how obsolete this looks in this game. But before we get on to the release, there's one more thing I have to talk about, which is one particular bit of promotion for the second game that there's bizarrely little information on. Rayman was in a pop song. In 1999, a duo known as Royal V produced a parody of Mel Brooks' song It's Good to Be the King featuring the same name, but instead of being about the French Revolution, was now about Rayman himself. It had a full music video and integrated footage from Rayman 2 itself, including some cut content. The group was comprised of two aspiring musicians, Jamel Cardaraba and Vince McClenny, who happened to be approached and asked to participate in a song for the upcoming Rayman game. Not that much is known about this song or the group in general, or any of the other songs the duo would go on to make. Other than it did manage to gain a little bit of traction around the time, and that it managed to hit #1 in the French discotheques at the time, although one member of the duo, Jamel, unfortunately passed away aged 49 in 2021. But Vince would still go on to release a new version of this song titled It's Still Good to Be the King in 2023, having been contacted by indie developer New Dawn Games, who have been working on a fan-made HD remake of this game, and asked him to produce a follow-up song, which Vince happily accepted, putting the song out on digital stores under the Royal V name. But anyway, eventually in October 1999, Rayman 2: The Great Escape was released in Europe on the N64, followed by PC and Sega Dreamcast, which restored the high-quality textures and featured Eric Chevalier on the soundtrack rather than Daniel Masson, who only composed for the N64 version exclusively, which could either sound like a MIDI version of the main soundtrack or just entirely different, basically how the Jaggy report of Rayman 1 did it. However, the Dreamcast version would feature an opening narration and an overhauled level select area. Then the game released on the PlayStation 1 almost a whole year later, with arguably worse textures than the N64 version, saved even more disk space by cutting a ton of content down from the game, and replaced the charming Banjo-Kazooie-esque gibberish dialogue for actual voice acting. This would properly introduce David Gassman as the English voice of Rayman in virtually all Rayman media to come, but despite that, the voice acting was incredibly corny. Interestingly, this version also exclusively featured the original 2D prototype of this game, so there's your one reason to choose this very much nerfed version of the game. And then barely a couple of months later, the PlayStation 2 version came out with an entirely different name and cover art. Rayman Revolution is arguably the most complete version of the game, featuring the best 3D graphics for the game, unlockable and purchasable abilities for Rayman, a tool to help you collect missing collectible items, new minigames, new bosses, new story events, new music, more enemy variety and slightly increased difficulty, and replaces the level select map with a huge open world hub where you physically travel to each stage now. It also added voice acting again, but completely overhauled from the PS1 version, with a handful of the VAs coming back and re-recording their dialogue to an improved quality. And then way after that, the N64 version of the game was ported to the Nintendo DS as Rayman DS in March 2005, now with some extra bugs, followed by the Dreamcast version of the game onto the Nintendo 3DS in March 2011 as Rayman 3D, which had even more bugs and accidentally made it impossible to obtain the 1000th lum in the game and beat 100%. Okay, are we done with the ports? Okay, good. So it's clear that almost every version of this game was somewhat different from one another in almost drastic ways. But this was nowhere near as different as this game's tone was compared to its predecessor. The wonderful, upbeat, whimsical atmosphere of the majority of the first game is pretty much replaced by this bleak new world, opening with the new antagonists imprisoning Rayman and essentially declaring victory over a conquered, decaying, starving, and enslaved world. Oh, and said antagonists are a band of swashbuckling pirates, but not just any pirates, robot pirates, on a flying buccaneer pirate ship in the sky. Hey, I love that movie. But after a daring prison escape, one might even call it great, Rayman is lost and fending for himself, trying to free his friends from captivity before he's given a quest to find 4 legendary masks in hidden temples to awaken an ancient god known as Polycus. Because this talking egg with Mr. Ticklearms is the only thing that can wipe out the pirates and defeat their leader, Admiral Razorbeard, for good. along with you, of course. But going back to the differences, it's almost like everything that was featured in the first game has been completely rebranded in some capacity as well. The source of the world's energy changed from the Great Protoon to the heart of the world. Its energy comes from lums, which replace tings in terms of points, and you now free familiar spirits and this new race called Tidsies, among other things in the PS1 port. And the fairy that grants you your new powers is now called Lee. The only things that make a return from the first game are Rayman himself, those purple lums you later swing off, and Bzz, when he's more than just a 5-second cameo in the first level that I was convinced was trying to kill me as a kid. Although this game does introduce several important things that do actually become recurring between games, including those aforementioned lums and Tidsies, a tutorial green bottle fly called Murphy, and Rayman's best friend, Globox the Toad thing, who has over 650 children. We never get to see his wife again though. And what do I think of this game after all that? Well, this game is excellent. It expands on the world and lore behind Rayman and his world excellently, and the control is mostly sound, especially for the time that this game came out. In spite of the vastly different setting, the world still feels alive and breathing, which gets you feeling incredibly immersed into the setting, even more than before. And the soundtrack still delivers on feeling like a part of the world, including the more synth military robot motifs. The other hero motifs that keep cropping up every now and then. The more ambient pieces like in the swamps and the woods and temples. Okay, I could go on all day about how every Rayman game has a phenomenal soundtrack, whoever is in charge of it for whatever game. Look, there's a reason I use it so many times in my videos, so I'll just leave a list of my favorites from this game on screen for you here. Funnily enough, this was one of the first video games I ever played as a child, with my mum claiming that she found a disc for the game on PC bundled with French fashion magazine La Redoute while trying to pick out clothes for young me. But what did the critics say? Well, they liked it a lot. The game consistently received 4-star ratings or higher from most publications, with people calling it gorgeous, cute, polished, and slick. Hell, IGN even described it as one of the most impressively executed platformers that genre had ever seen, and told people to simply forget about Crash, Banjo, and Mario 64. Now that is high praise. But then again, it is IGN. It got nominated for the Game Developer's Choice for Excellence in Level Design in 2001, as well as multiple other awards following release, including Interactive Achievement's Game of the Year. It even garnered several McDonald's Happy Meals toys between May and June of 2000 in France. There were also some physical maps of the game world that came with some copies of the game. Oh, and fear not, because the difficulty is much more forgiving than the last game. It's actually to the point where some people complain about this game being too easy now, so they at least took some advice from the first game on board. If you want my personal recommendations for all the different versions of the game, I would have to recommend the PS1 version among the least, unfortunately. It just feels like the least powerful, has those jarring voice roles, some of the least content, and it seems like most people who try and get into the game through the PS1 end up the most disappointed. I would personally recommend the PC version myself, which is almost identical to the Dreamcast version, but is also the most accessible in this age. Just be warned that the control scheme is a little weird for some reason, in that the jump and attack buttons are swapped over, and there's no way of changing the button bindings without hacking the game. But I do still have a soft spot for the PS2 version, for feeling like the most alive and completed version of the game. It may be one of the slightly buggier ports, is locked at 30 FPS, and can feel a little bloated with all the new content it's added, and the voice acting is passable, but it feels far more interconnected with its open world setting. Not all the new additions are highly consequential, but it's just nice to have them in the background and make the world feel more involved. And it also completely negates the rushed discovery of the final mask in every other port by replacing the reward for that mission with an all-new ability, and puts the final mask behind a new, actually quite climactic boss fight with a really cool theme and gameplay flow, as well as a really funny face. Just, why the did this kid have it in nearly all versions? You are a child! It was no secret by this point that Rayman was a real hotshot, and people were falling head over heels for the slimest French croissant. And while another sequel was being made, more spin-offs. There was going to be what looked to be a spin-off game titled Rayman Adventures, set during the events of Rayman 2, and looked to feature Globox more as a main character alongside Rayman. But this would get cancelled quite quickly, and only exists now in the form of a teaser trailer. We had some sports games, including Rayman Bowling and Rayman Golf for Java Mobile, developed by Gameloft, who are more so known today as the guys who developed Disney's Dreamlight Valley. Yeah, even they got involved with Rayman at one point. They would work on a number of cheap Rayman mobile ports throughout the 2000s, including Rayman Ultimate, which ported a handful of Rayman 1 onto Windows phones by the end of 2003, and the rarest of all of these being Rayman Garden, being released on only a few models of Mitsubishi phones as a pre-installed game at the end of 2001. Though an unofficial re-release was published on PC via GameJolt by Rayman Universe in 2021. And yeah, while these all appear to be cheap, licensed knockoffs, there was one spin-off in particular that became quite fondly remembered. In April 2001, a spin-off Rayman game was announced by IGN to be coming to modern 6th-gen consoles. A spin-off that was intended to be a party game split into two separate game modes, Rayman Tribe and Rayman Shooting Fish. Early concepts of the levels were looking to be heavily inspired by the environments from Rayman 2, with the final levels they went with in the end branching out to be somewhat more original in the end. But eventually, these two projects would combine into one game, and would go on to be released in Europe in November 2001 as Rayman M, and then almost a whole year later in North America as Rayman Arena on PC, GameCube, Xbox, and PS2, with the GameCube and Xbox versions being almost radically different from the original port in various ways we'll be taking a look at in a bit. The game was playable in single player and as a local multiplayer, and a fully online mode was considered in development, relying on Gameloft servers, but this wouldn't make the final cut in the end. The M stands for multiplayer, in case you couldn't guess. There was also a D-make for the PS1 called Rayman Rush, which only featured one of the two game modes, and only supported two-player multiplayer as opposed to 4 like the main ports could. The game features the two aforementioned game modes of Tribe and Shooting Fish that would actually consist of an on-foot racing mode and a third-person battle mode. The racing side also contained some sub-game modes such as Lums, where you would have to complete the course collecting enough Lums hidden around alternative paths, and Popolapoi, which is basically a time trial where you add time on for yourself by brutally hunting down some innocent butterflies on the track. Lum Fight for the battle mode was basically your standard fighting arena, where you have to pick up various different power-ups around the map to attack other players, with the first to hit a certain number of kills being the winner. Lum Spring has players collecting a particular lum that spawns in various places, trying to stun opponents before they can get there first, and Capture the Fly is basically who can hold down the fly in their possession for the longest. The local multiplayer mode would allow you to customize these games, even if you were playing solo, where you could adjust the difficulty, ability drop rates, and even add a time limit onto the games. There were 8 playable characters in this one, including 3 all-new characters, a new robot pirate design, this thing, who happens to be voiced by Jodie Forrest, who's actually the same person who voices Jade in Beyond Good and Evil, True Story, and Razor Waifu. Why does her theme song actually go hard? There were also some dark variants of Rayman and Globox, which would only appear in the GameCube version, with Dark Rayman also appearing in the Xbox version, and would basically be an antagonist in the harder levels the further through you get. These versions would also feature less sub-game modes overall, but would feature all new cutscenes preceding a race, with Murphy, voiced by Gassman himself, introducing an event in the characters' locker rooms before they proceed to brutally murder him. These versions would also contain unused character skins in the files, including one turning Globox into Superman, as well as several placeholder icons for the items in battle mode, including one of Jeff Goldblum's face for some reason. Reception to this game was lukewarm and rather mixed among critics, although one of the best descriptors for this game came from Tom Bramwell of Eurogamer, who described it as, quote, a cross-country steeplechase dodgeball simulation. You, sir, have hit the nail right on the head. Many people thought of it as a lesser version of Mario Party, but the game still warranted an appearance on the Rayman 10th anniversary bundle later down the line, and has developed a cult following among fans over time. For me personally, I had a lot of fun with it as a kid. The maps and sub-game modes were enough to keep me very entertained. I enjoyed the slapstick tone and constant platforming elements throughout the game, and once again, the soundtrack was indeed fire. I think between the two versions, I prefer the updated look of the GameCube version's races for that game mode. Plus, it removes those other two game modes and instead includes Time Attack, where the game gradually eliminates the player in last place until only one remains. But I would say I prefer the PS2's Battle mode, since the GameCube has you fight in timed matches by default, and the winner is whoever can score the most hits in that time. Not KOs, hits. I don't really get it either. On the whole, I can't really see it as something I'd get into if I picked it up for the first time today as an adult, unfortunately, but it is very clear to me why this game has amassed its cult following online. I wonder if Ubisoft will ever give Rayman party games another go in the future. Okay, before we finally get on to the next mainline game, there is one more project I wanted to go back and talk about quickly. See, there was another quite significant spin-off that was planned to release simultaneously with Rayman 2 in 1999, because Rayman was coming to TV. That's right, Ubisoft themselves had developed a full TV pilot to go alongside Rayman 2 that was set to feature 26 episodes at approximately 13 minutes in length each. The series was intended to release worldwide. However, due to high expenses and poor marketing, the show was altogether cancelled and only 4 episodes would ever release. There's also rumours that 6 episodes in total got produced, but not very much is clear on that right now. The main plot saw Rayman, who is voiced by Billy West of all people, captured by Admiral Razorbeard and sent off as a performer for Rigatoni's circus, eventually escaping with 4 more prisoners: Bettina, Cookie, Flips, and Lakmak. The series followed numerous shenanigans between the 5 of them. Rayman breaks into a hospital, Rayman spies on the police, Rayman can't work out how to say car, and none of the supporting characters would ever be seen or referenced again. English, French, and German dubs of this show's 4 episodes would be released on DVD and VHS in France, Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as in parts of the United States and Australia, as well as being bundled with some French copies of Rayman 2. Like before, the show has another cult following, but a lot smaller than Rayman Arenas. Though honestly, I actually enjoyed these episodes far more than I thought I would when I finally watched them. The animation is a little rough and cheap, and there were some moments that were a little rushed, but it was overall a decent children's cartoon with an enjoyable dynamic of main characters, and I'll even admit it did get a few chuckles out of me. It's nothing standout or groundbreaking, but I couldn't call it bad either, and I do think it definitely had some potential. Our hero is a little goofier on here compared to what we'd previously seen up to this point, although I'm sure Rayman wouldn't stray too far from his traditional personality on TV again. But of course, while those teams worked hard on those knockoffs, Michel Ancel was hard at work on his own next big project to come out from Ubisoft, not Rayman. Instead, he was working on his brand new project Beyond Good and Evil almost immediately after Rayman 2 released, allegedly wanting to move on to a different project from Rayman to avoid getting burnt out, and acted only as an advisor for the following game. So with a different team on deck, and Rayman 2 co-writer David Nace now as the sole writer for the new project, work on the next Rayman game would commence. The work on this second sequel is alleged to have begun as far back as the turn of the millennium, with a project under the working name of Rayman 2000, which would have been a direct follow-up to The Great Escape, but set in a more urban setting, per request of Ancel. This version would be cancelled before it even hit the prototype stage, though some of the city designs apparently served as inspiration for the animated series, and some scenery concepts would later evolve into Clearleaf Forest in the actual game to come. Lead game programmer Olivier Doba also stated they planned for more first-person segments to appear in the game, inspired by playing a lot of Half-Life at the time, which ended up mostly getting cut due to time restraints, as well as the idea of finally giving Rayman legs, which was very quickly dismissed. Nevertheless, Rayman 3 Hoodlum Havoc was released worldwide in February 2003 on GameCube, PS2, Xbox, and PC. What did they give us this time? They gave Rayman an enormous feature. The plot is that a new type of evil lum named Andre is transforming all the peaceful red lums into evil hoodlums, and you have to stop him. However, within level 1, this nasty ball of fluff is accidentally consumed by your returning best friend Glowbox, and half of the entire game is spent trying to get him out of Glowbox. Rayman 3 is the biggest tonal shift between games to date. The main faces from the last game return, like Murphy, Glowbox, and the Tidsies, who are pretty much the main sidecast in Rayman games from now on. The heart of the world is still important, red lums still give you health, and you're still breaking open cages to rescue captives, now with their own character motivations.
Godspeed, Pilgrim.
Although the plot was apparently supposed to have a lot more elements than what we got, like the return of Clark the Giant from the last game, Rayman and Glowbox flying between levels on a big bird who'd get injured mid-flight, and they'd have to ask that woman in the third world to make them a cure. There'd have been a volcano level where Rayman would obtain a silver lum that would grant him a permanent ability like in the last game, and in the final boss you'd have to destroy the scepter giving Reflux his power by shooting mirrors to redirect rays in it to free the Leptus who was trapped inside him. Anyway, the game also happened to feature a handful of big voices as well, including Billy West from the animated series returning, but this time to play as Murphy, and John Leguizamo as Glowbox, and an uncredited Ziggy Marley as Reflux the Canaran. Yeah, the son of Bob Marley, who was also in Shark Tale and Across the Spider-Verse. Though many of these voices weren't actually heard in the prototype demos of this game that came bundled in some copies of Rayman Revolution, implying that these voices may have been recorded relatively close to launch with placeholders in their place instead. For instance, the voiceover you hear during the Hood Stomper boss in level 2 was originally voicing Andre and Murphy during the game's prototype stages.
Coming to you live from Clearly Stadium, local favorite Rayman is on hand to settle the score with the Hoodlums. Okay, now I'm good to go. Come on, let's move.
And we also had some of the Tidsies voiced by Matt Hill in the final game, who there's a strong chance is the same Matt Hill who played Ed from Ed, Edd and Eddy. This one, Raphael in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, plus some of the minions in the Crash of the Titans games. And I think Jodie Forrest from earlier comes back to voice another fairy as well. But I digress. Getting back to the game itself, the tone has jumped from that bleak, heroic underdog feel from The Great Escape in favor of silly, slapstick, cartoonish wackiness and surprisingly adult humor for an E-rated game. Glowbox has gone from cowardly but big-hearted to cowardly dumbass who periodically becomes drunk, and Murphy has gone from friendly encyclopedia to whiny, sarcastic fourth wall breaker who delivers false promises. We'll get to that part later. The Tidsies pretty much stayed the same though. Nevertheless, I freaking adore this game. I won't give too much of my personal thoughts on this one since I already made a whole video discussing why I hold Rayman 3 so near and dear to me, from its vastly improved control, great combat system, and my favorite environments, bosses, and music in any Rayman game, including an incredible final boss at the end. While Ansel has stated he would have done things very differently if he had still helmed the project, that doesn't mean he would disown it, and the people who did make this were still very successful in transporting you into this world that is Rayman's. I might be biased because of nostalgia, but I genuinely think this game holds up to modern platformers in spite of its flaws. Which brings me to another point I touched upon at the end of my other video, and why I'm focusing so much on the tone of these games, and why I think this drastic tonal shift would become very problematic to Rayman's future. Because aside from the obvious elephant in the room of Rayman's looks, what exactly is this damn thing? We've gone from cute, charming, creative cartoon world to fantasy glade of Eden being overrun by a force that this underdog must beat the odds to rid his world of, to that again, but taking itself nowhere near as seriously. Like I said in that Rayman 3 video, I don't mind the direction of the humor. I actually kind of enjoy it, and it isn't too out of place on its own. But at the end of the day, while they have all technically evolved brilliantly, the three mainline games we've been given now suddenly feel like three ideas tugging each other at different directions, rather than being an evolution of the franchise. Perhaps as a result of Ansel's absence as a director, an issue that would come back to haunt this character very soon. Either way, reviews came in consistently positive for this game, mostly scoring between 70 and 80%, and it sold over 1 million copies within a month. While that tonal shift was jarring for some, it was still favoured generally well by fans at the time, and is even more fondly remembered by Rayman fans today. And naturally, there were plenty of other ports of it too, though not quite in the same sense of Rayman 2 in that each version was the same base game with slightly different approaches to things. Each mainline console release of Rayman 3 was essentially the same game, although the GameCube version did have additional bonus levels if you connected it with another copy of the game for the Game Boy Advance. Speaking of which, the Rayman 3 that would release on the GBA and N-Gage systems couldn't be more different, and are basically the early concepts of what Rayman 3 was originally supposed to be, featuring far more references to the content from the previous game, including the robot pirates who are completely absent from this game besides a hidden Easter egg. An HD remaster was later released in 2012 on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, which added achievements, leaderboards for the game's unique scoring system, and was upscaled to 720p 60 FPS. They did, however, remove those bizarre wanna-kick Rayman bonus videos, replacing them with concept art for another game that had recently come out by this time. And that kick-ass Groove Armada song that would play every time you booted the game sadly got the boot too, which, it's just not the same without it. They also increased the age rating on this release of the game, which, honestly, I do not blame them.
If it takes forever.
It's a common saying to be careful what you say on the internet, because that bum-fumbled wax will stick with you forever and ever. That can most certainly be said with one particular line from Rayman 3, and not even one of the more risque ones.
See you in Rayman 4!
And boy have we hounded on Ubisoft for that one for the past 2 decades. The concepts of a third Rayman sequel, the aforementioned Rayman 4, were initially drawn up in 2005, with help from Studio Phoenix Interactive, best known for such projects as Winnie the Pooh's Rumbly Tumbly Adventure. So that explains that weird crossover release. It's said that plenty of concept art was made for Rayman 4, including remade environments reminiscent of stages from the first game, including Bandland and Picture City. The special power-ups that appeared in Rayman 3 would return, Mr. Dark would return as antagonist along with the pirates and other big bads from Rayman 1, as well as the evil dark variant of Rayman from the first game. It would have seen Rayman going all the way back to his roots, a single game to connect the bizarre and diverse journey this character has had so far. There was also apparently a young human girl called CL, whose purpose remains unknown. They also gave us this infamous piece of promo.
You're my saxophone, and baby you can turn me on. Baby you can turn me on.
Thank you so much for introducing me to Max Rob, you bizarre thing. However, only 4 months after development started for the game, for an unknown reason, the whole idea was cancelled. Then, in 2006, development started again. Michel Ancel was back as a designer, having completed Beyond Good and Evil, and an actually pretty decent for the time King Kong movie tie-in game, and was intent on developing the Rayman 4 platformer. The new plot was supposedly to have Andre return from the previous game and team up with Rayman and that one Stone Doctor from the last game to defeat a brand new enemy. Enter the Army of Rabbits. Ugh. The game would have apparently involved beat-em-up style combat, multiple rideable animals, rescuing a damsel in distress possibly related to the original project, but is now whatever species Rayman is, and some sort of hypnotization minigame at the end of each level to get you to new places. So, this sounds interesting so far, and all was going well, until the developers received something in the mail. It was a package from Nintendo, sending them a developer kit for their new upcoming console, the fabled Nintendo Wii. And then, everything changed. The developers would experiment with the new motion-controlled gimmicky gameplay functions that the Wii offered, and the platformer style they had developed for months was to be mostly scrapped. The original Rabbit platformer concept of Rayman 4 would eventually be leaked years later in 2022, giving us playable levels from what this game would have been. Nevertheless, Ubisoft still wanted to use this concept, but market it more so towards the Nintendo Wii and its unique controls, which was already causing a huge fuss amongst the gaming crowd. And so, here is what we got instead of Rayman 4.